Hello and welcome, students. This is Mr. Panza focusing on today's question: how do we recognize and identify different shapes? In a previous video here in Geometry's unit, we went over the different properties of two-dimensional and three-dimensional shapes through the use of a shape song. If you haven't had an opportunity to actually check out that shape song, I recommend you do it right now, or at the very least, download the lyrics. It has all of the different properties that you will need to know. Otherwise, this is more of a review video. So let's take a look at some questions to review the properties and see what you remember and how you can apply it. What are the properties of two-dimensional shapes, and how do we identify these different two-dimensional shapes? So let's take a look first. All of these are flat shapes, and they can only be drawn on paper. They only have length and width, and they are sometimes called plane shapes. Here are some picture examples: a dodecagon, an octagon, or square, trapezoid, triangle, and rhombus or parallelogram. All of these would be considered what? The answer is polygons, or two-dimensional shapes. All of these are polygons because they have at least three sides, they're closed, they all have straight sides, and because this all has length and width but not depth, we're talking about 2D shapes. Let's get a little more specific. Plane shapes. Two-dimensional shapes that have sides made from straight lines. Specifically, triangles, squares, hexagons. Here are some other examples as well. A rhombus over here, a parallelogram, rectangle, square, and triangle. All of these are what? If you said polygons, you would be correct. A polygon has at least three straight sides. I'm emphasizing straight because a polygon will never have a wiggly or curved side. It must be straight, and it must be a closed shape. We all know this. It's a circle. One side. Many students confuse the fact that because it's round, it's not considered a side, but it is. It's just rounded, and there's only one in a circle. How about this one? The properties of this shape is the fact that it is a two-dimensional shape with four sides that are all the exact same length and four 90-degree angles. 90-degree angle goes right here, so in other words, this line and this line are perpendicular. So are these two, and these two, and these two. The opposite sides of this shape are also parallel. So what's the only shape that has four equal sides, 90-degree angles, and opposite sides are parallel? Take a shot. What do you think? This is a square. I like to call this one the queen of all of the different shapes because it follows so many rules. And in order for a shape to be considered a square, it must follow all of the rules that you see right here. It must have four sides of equal length. Opposite sides must be parallel to each other, and the 90-degree angles are key because we'll see other shapes that have equal length sides, but the angles will be different, and that will be categorized differently based on that property. Let's continue. The next one is a two-dimensional shape with three sides, and as long as there are three angles and the lines are straight, we're talking about a triangle, of course. How about a four-sided shape with four right angles? Opposite sides are equal and parallel. What do you think this shape is? If you said rectangle, you would have been correct. Now, what makes the difference between a rectangle and a square is subtle but key. Please notice that this last property of a rectangle makes it a rectangle. Opposite sides are equal to one another and parallel, which means my top and bottom pair of sides have the equal length, but they are not equal to the sides right here on the left and right. However, the left and right lines do have the same length. But because they do not have the equal four lengths and sides, it is not a square. But a square can be considered a rectangle because a square does match all of these properties. A square has four sides, it has four right angles, and the opposite sides of a square are equal and parallel. In fact, all sides are equal in a square. But what makes a rectangle different is the fact that the opposite sides are equal to one another, but they are not to the sides on left and right. That's what makes the rectangle just a little bit different. This is a shape that has 4 equal sides and opposite sides are parallel. In fact, this is more of a broad type of topic of many different shapes. If I have 4 equal sides and the opposite sides are parallel, you may initially start thinking this has to be a square. What do you think it is? If you said rhombus, then you would have been correct. If you said square, I would have understood where your guess was. However, a square, remember, must have 90-degree angles in order to make it a square. A rhombus doesn't follow that rule. A rhombus, although does have 4 equal sides, meaning they all have the same exact length, notice that the angles are not 90 degrees. These two angles are less than 90 degrees, and these two angles are greater than 90 degrees, and that's what makes it a rhombus. It doesn't follow the 90-degree rule that a square does. However, you can call a square a rhombus because a square does have 4 equal sides, and the opposite sides in a square are parallel to each other. How about this shape? Kind of awkward, and I could draw a different way to have a 90-degree angle because it only has one pair of parallel sides. What do you believe this shape is? If you guessed trapezoid, you would be correct. A trapezoid just has one pair, the top and bottom in this example, of parallel sides. Notice that the left and right will eventually cross, and that's what makes it a trapezoid, because only one set, or 2 lines, are parallel to each other. Now in these 2 examples, I have a rhombus over here and a rectangle over here. These have opposite sides that are parallel to each other, which means I am talking about a category that I can put a rectangle and a rhombus, and really what's not listed here is a square. What is that category? What would these 2 shapes, as well as a square, be underneath? What category would it be? If you said parallelogram, that would be correct, because the rule for parallelograms is that opposite sides must be parallel. And in a rhombus, like you see here on the left, and a rectangle, like you see here on the right, and not pictured a square, opposite sides in all 3 of those shapes are parallel. And in that case, we can call them a parallelogram. Here's a 2-dimensional shape with 5 sides and 5 angles. What is the name of this polygon? It's a pentagon. A 5-sided shape with 5 angles is the pentagon. I like to remember this one by saying, hey, it kind of looks like home plate in baseball. Plate, pentagon, both begin with P, and that's how I remember pentagon. A 6-sided shape with 6 angles is known as a hexagon. I like to remember this one by seeing that there is an X in the word hexagon, and there is also an X in the word 6. 6, hex. That's how I remember 6-sided figure. And an 8-sided figure with 8 angles is, of course, an octagon. So those are all of the different properties for 2-dimensional shapes. If you check back later, the only other thing that we'll talk about are some 3-dimensional shapes. Really, you just have to know that those are not flat shapes. They have length, width, and depth. However, try and get to know the properties of all of the different 2-dimensional shapes, and you should be in good shape. Thanks. Hope this video helps. Talk to you soon.